Using gradients to fill and stroke objects is a really fantastic way to give depth to your images in Inkscape. And if we look at this particular image, it looks so much better just because of the fact that we've got this gradient for the background and this handle area of the violin. Even though these colors are pretty horrific, it still just has a much better effect because there's this nice gradient that we've got. So what we're going to see now is how to apply your own gradients, and I'm going to use this little object behind the strings here in as example. So again, you need to be working in the fill and stroke panel. If you don't have it open, just double click on either one of these colored bars in the bottom left corner. And at the moment we can see that the fill of this object is set to a flat color, and that flat color is red. Now if you click on gradient, so we have two options, linear and radial, it will immediately create a new gradient based on whatever the fill color of this object is. So if I click linear gradient, we immediately see here linear gradient 6405, and we can see that it's starting with whatever our fill color was. If I go back to flat color and change this fill color to something like this bright green, and I now click gradient, you'll see that the gradient starts from that bright green. So now what you want to do is you want to edit this gradient, because the gradient you get by default is very seldom going to be exactly what you want. So what you do is you simply click this edit button, and that gives you the gradient editor dialog box. And if you click here, you see this stop 6415. This little menu tells you how many stops there are in this gradient. So we currently have 2 stops. But the way that it's set up at first is actually very confusing. So I just want to go over exactly what this means. These color bars, you might think that they tell you where exactly the green is ending, kind of like it looks over here. But it actually isn't. The fact that this is fully green means that it's 100% opaque. The fact that this stop is shown as half transparent and half green means that it's half transparent, which is a very confusing thing to do. So the first thing you want to do, the first thing that I suggest, is just to select each stop and make sure that this alpha bar is set right up to the maximum. So if we now go to stop 6417, you see that alpha is actually set to 0, and so that's why we have this weird kind of icon here. If you just drag this all the way up to the top, then it becomes fully opaque. So now both stops are completely green, and so our gradient is completely green. I find it much easier to work with gradients that go from one color to another, rather than from one color to kind of transparent. So now what you can do is you can just edit the color of each stop. So I'm going to take this first stop, and I'm going to change its color to something like a nice deep red. So there we get this nice deep red, and as you can see, our first stop, which is located at the very edge, left edge of this gradient, is now a deep red. Then what I can do is select the second stop, and I'm going to change this to a kind of bright orange color. And then you see, very simply, we've got a nice gradient that fades in. Just to go over again what this alpha bar is doing, if I want the orange part, or the yellowish part of this gradient, to kind of blend into the background, I can reduce this value. And now you can see that the background, this blue, is starting to kind of shine through there. And when you start with a gradient, they put this down to 0, which can be very confusing, and that's why you get this weird, strange icon. So just to reiterate, the first thing you want to do when you have a new gradient is just to select each stop and make sure that it's 100% opaque. Now let's say that I wanted to have a little bit more control. So for example, let's say I want this to go from red to a kind of orange and then to a really bright yellow. You can then simply add another stop. So right now we just have 2 stops. If I click add stop, we now have a third. And the way that it actually works when it adds a stop is it'll add it between the two other stops, and it'll give it by default the color that's halfway between them. So I could now click this stop, and I could change its color slightly. I want to make it a nice bright orange. And when you have more than two stops, for the stops in the middle, you can actually change the offset. So right now this is set to 50%, which means it's exactly halfway between the left and the right. If I move it over, we can see that that orange stop is moving over to the right, and vice versa. So that very simply is how you create gradients. The best advice I can give you when you create a gradient is, as soon as you get into this editor, just go straight down to this A section, put all of them up to 100% for each stop, and then you can just change your colors, and you're going to have very little problems working from there on. Otherwise things can be very confusing.